Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to go through an experience, then make a case, then start to go through some material. So first, I was at the American Massage Conference very recently in Orlando, Florida, helping out on the back end and technical side. So as I was walking through some classrooms, I heard somebody who was teaching essentially what you would call an osteopathic approach, and they were providing some history with respect to Dr. Andrew Taylor Still, who called himself the discoverer of osteopathy. He didn't call himself the founder, called himself the discoverer. I may misquote this. It's one of the lines that I like. I can't remember which book it's in, but essentially it goes, generally, you ask me how old osteopathy is, I will tell you it is as old as the universe. I discovered it while I was in Kansas. Right? So he is pointing to a phenomenon that exists regardless of who's tapping into it. So I appreciate that. But anyways, the individual providing the class that was essentially an osteopathic method or an osteopathic approach was speaking about history, noted some things that I just knew to be factually incorrect. And I want to make sure I'm saying that there was no malice. The individual was trying to point to the history as valuable to provide context, which I think is useful. The challenge is that I specifically knew that what they were saying had errors in it, and to attempt to correct those errors in the moment isn't particularly useful because it just creates an adversarial situation. So what I've chosen to do is to dive into history of the osteopathic profession in my way, while acknowledging that there's a lot of good historical material that's available with great ease that people can peruse themselves. One of the challenges with different people reading the same documents is that they will interpret them in a variable way. So we can point back to the concept of constructivism, which essentially would hold that the truth is dependent on the individual, their previous experiences, and the current environment of observation. So we have to acknowledge that different people will interpret the same material in alternate ways, such that the reason I'm doing this isn't because the black and white documents aren't there, it's to provide maybe a different on-ramp for those who are interested. So the case that I'm going to make is that I think the history has value in order to develop context for what is currently going on, whatever you think of that, good, bad, or indifferent, positive, negative, what have you, because it sets the stage for different forms of conversation. I think we would all benefit from acknowledging that there's going to be errors in everything we do that we can't detect and others can help us detect. So hopefully I'm going to add to the conversation so that people understand the context. You can go back and engage with material that I've previously put out, the Osteopathic History Project, where really what I was talking about more was how knowledge claims were built. Now, even in that, I have to acknowledge that if I go back and look at it, I'm sure at this point I could find some things that I'd like to alter. It doesn't negate the value of what I did, because the value of what I did was go through a lot of old osteopathic books and note how they were coming to the positions that allowed them to make claims on truth, right? So if we examine it in a way to understand how they came to what they said and see its strengths and weaknesses, we have the opportunity to alter direction, alter approach, appreciate the fantastic things that were done in the past, but also iterate on them. So start from the new point of learning by recognizing the good, the bad, and possibly the ugly, right? So the first thing I'm going to read, and I'll do a decent amount on Dr. Still across time. I may even attempt to connect with some people who their job is history, or they have done the production of historical works, right? So I will possibly try to engage them if it's possible. The first thing I'm going to read is from Dr. Still's autobiography, right? So it's the preface from the autobiography. I want to read this so that it helps set the context and set the stage for trying to interpret what Dr. Still writes, right? So this is the preface from the autobiography. I will inform the reader at the outset that this book is written to state facts without being confined to exact dates and figures. So right away, the first sentence, Dr. Still is completely acknowledging that he is not necessarily going to be completely accurate on dates. Now, when you look at some of his stuff, say the time of day when he was hit by the ram of reason, if you're reading varying books that he produced, the time of day will vary a little bit. That's not necessarily a giant issue, because what he's trying to communicate a concept more than he's trying to communicate the exact time. So the exact time may be less valuable than the concept. And he's making sure that at the outset that you understand that's likely what he's trying to do. Now, do I know that for a fact? No, I don't know that for a fact. Never had the chance to meet the man because I wasn't alive. So anyways, we'll go back to reading. Events that have made a lasting impressions on my mind, stated as correctly as possible from memory, are narrated here without regard to the rules of fine writing. I never kept any notes of my life, therefore the stories may appear disconnected. While when I tell you of an event, it will be the truth as I remember it, regardless of how it may look in print. I want to avoid biography as I write, for the reason biographies are so nicely worded that the reader often has to ask whom the narrator is in giving a write-up. Notwithstanding, I am often told that I ought to get a professional biographer to write my life. I've concluded to write it myself. Okay, so just a broad acknowledgement from Dr. Still that some of what he writes down is from memory. We have to acknowledge memory is fallible. He didn't keep notes. So you might be running into big fish stories. You know, every time you tell the story, the fish gets bigger when you read some of what Dr. Still writes. If you're really, really rigorous, you can start to notice some of those similarities, some of those inconsistencies. And to some degree, that has value if that's what you care about, and to some degree, it doesn't have value if you don't care about it. The important thing is to acknowledge that when Still wrote that he was doing it from memory, which has knowable fallibility or knowable errors in just how it works, right? So when you read about Dr. Still, historically, there are problems with accuracy, but there are likely not problems with concept that he individually was trying to communicate. Sometimes you need to look a little bit deeper at the context or the things that were informing him with respect to how to interpret what he was saying. If you don't do that, easy to run into some troubles. So one of the things I'm going to do first is sort of, again, situate things as I step forward and try to start to go through a little bit more historical material, is to read an essay or an article by John Lewis. So John Lewis in 2012 put out a book, A.T. Still, From the Dry Bone to the Living Man. I've had the chance to read it. I don't own a copy. So for me to refer to it properly is inappropriate because I just don't physically have a copy. That's neither here nor there. John Lewis specifically went to Kirksville, did have, I believe, a paid position in Kirksville, whereby he was able to have access to the archives of what is now the Museum of Osteopathic History. I think it's the Museum of Osteopathic History. It might be the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine. Terminologically, it's in Kirksville. It is housed at A.T. Still University, and it is run by Jason Haxton. All right, so I'm going to read some of this essay. I'm not going to read it from the beginning, but I'm going to read what I think are salient parts. So keeping in mind that when I read what I think are salient parts, you should go and read it, because maybe when you read it, you won't agree with what I'm doing when I speak to what's written here. Okay, so so I'm going to read from the second paragraph. It soon became clear that most of the school's faculty harbored the same misunderstandings and prejudices about Still that had plagued him even during his lifetime. To pull out of the reading, he's talking about being at the British School of Osteopathy. Very few of my tutors and lecturers had actually read his writings, and when I asked them to explain the philosophy of osteopathy, without exception, they reiterated the four principles that appear in the osteopathic texts. The body is a unit, the body possesses self-regulatory mechanisms, structure and function are reciprocally interrelated. Rational treatment is based upon these principles. This, too, I found curious. Did it mean that the philosophy and principles were the same thing? To me, that did not make sense. Okay, so when people speak about osteopathy and the principles of osteopathy, they give what I call three principles and a cop-out. So the first three principles maybe make some sense. It's just kind of a unity thing, right? Stuff that is housed in the same thing is related. Oh yay. And also it can heal itself, so whatever. But the fourth one is the cop-out, where it says rational treatment is based upon the previous three. So it's not even a principle, it's just, refer back. That's why I call it the cop-out. So Lewis is talking about this and his experience when being a student. Now, I should say that I have had the opportunity to speak with John Lewis in person. I've had the opportunity to meet him, so I have mild insight into some of this process. I'm not going to sit here and say that John and I are fantastic friends, but I have had the opportunity to speak with him in a variety of circumstances, which was very enjoyable. Right. So to continue to read. So I began to investigate the matter. My first surprise was to learn that the four principles were introduced to the profession in 1953 by a committee in Kirksville, and they were not the principles taught by Dr. Still. This raised a serious question. If no one knew Still's philosophy and the principles being taught were not his, what was I learning? Right? So again, John is setting the stage for some of the things he did. The four principles essentially were a committee that were attempting to put forth some concepts that would guide educational practices in osteopathic schools. Okay? So to continue to read, in 1997, 2 years after graduating, I traveled to Kirksville, Missouri to research in more detail. I remained there for nearly 5 years, and it took me a further decade to complete my biography, self-published in December 2012, A.T. Still, From the Dry Bone to the Living Man. Okay? To read again, next paragraph, the more I studied the founder and his teachings, the more I realized that this was one of the most important stories anyone could write, and that to do it justice, I needed to perfect the art of writing. It was not an easy story to compose either. It felt like trying to complete an impossibly difficult jigsaw puzzle without a picture. But the lengthy process of trying to fit the pieces together taught me that the most valuable lesson osteopathy was to Still primarily, even above a system of treatment, a philosophy, one quite different from the one I grew up, and which took much mental adjustment to fully grasp. Osteopathy is nature, he teaches. So he's quoting Still as osteopathy is nature. So this is where we get into a little bit more of the historical context from what Lewis is writing in this article. And this will allow us to set the stage to some degree for what will come for in the future about the past. A terrible personal tragedy began Still's questioning of medical practice. So to pull out of reading, this seems agreed upon, and the reason this is agreed upon is because it's in Dr. Still's autobiography. Yeah, he had been a doctor for 10 years when in February 1864, an outbreak of meningitis claimed 3 of his children and an adopted girl. As he languished in grief and disillusionment, however, he was struck a profound insight. I decided then that God was not a guessing God, but a God of truth, and all his works, spiritual and material, are harmonious. His law of animal life is absolute. So wise a God had certainly placed the remedy within the material house in which the spirit of life dwells. Okay, so quoting Still again, just talking about how a specific tragedy really shaped him, really shifted his direction and attention. Again, quite agreed upon. I've heard some musings that maybe it wasn't meningitis, maybe it was some other disease. Not 100% sure. Dr. Still does talk about one of the reasons he and I believe it was his oldest daughter survived, in his opinion, is because they drank strong black coffee. It may not have been the coffee, it may have been the boiling of water that was protective for them, because it seems, again, this is from memory and I may be wrong, it seems that the water source was implicated to some degree in whatever disease was moving around. So you boil water, you are able to kill many pathogens, most pathogens. Right? To read again, for the next 10 years, he struggled with the knowledge that medicine knew neither the cause nor the cure of not only meningitis, but disease generally, and that the drugs he had been taught to prescribe were ineffective and possibly dangerous. He was aware that the medical definition of disease was altered physiology, but no one knew what caused the physiology to go awry in the first place. But his insight raised a fundamental question. If the body innately contains all remedies needed for curing, what should be the role of the doctor? It inspired him to read extensively, not only medical books, but also natural sciences and philosophy. So this is actually where this period of time is where maybe there's a little bit less understanding, but there is some understanding. So I'm pretty sure I have Carol Trowbridge's book on Dr. Still, which does talk to some degree about this. It includes some of the stuff with respect to the Bloody Kansas conflict, living in Baldwin, Kansas, moving to Missouri because of the Bloody Kansas conflict, or not necessarily because of, after the Bloody Kansas conflict. It does also, if I remember right, Trowbridge's book does talk about Dr. Still's relationship with spiritualism. So not necessarily being spiritual or spiritual. There was a specific movement called spiritualism, right? So we will be able to touch on that to some degree as we go forward. Where did I stop reading? There we go. Natural sciences and philosophy. So the natural sciences and philosophy. So it's in here, I'm pretty sure. But I think Herbert Spencer ended up being very, very important. So you had Darwin, but you also had Spencer. So with respect to takes on what we term evolution, Spencer was, I think, more popular than Darwin, especially as the concept of evolution had spread, or its early spread. So to go back to read, philosophy, a subject that debated the relationship between God, man, and nature, was the key. Since childhood, Still had been indoctrinated with the Christian notion of an omnipotent God and of a man's dominion over nature. But he had entered medical practice on a Shawnee Indian reservation in Kansas, where his preacher-physician father had been sent as a missionary. Here, he was exposed to a radically different attitude towards the natural world. The Indians taught that man was part of nature, not its dominator, and that nature was pervaded by sacred wisdom. So this is actually an important piece of information, or say an important kind of tweak to a lot of things. So one of the things I did here when I was at the AMC was the suggestion that Dr. Still had spent some time with native tribes in North Carolina. To the best of my knowledge, he was never in North Carolina, didn't spend any time with any natives there. He not definitely. As far as we're able to tell, he did spend time with the Shawnee tribe. He does talk about, in the autobiography, utilizing deceased Shawnee bodies early on for dissection, because as far as I can recall, the Shawnee burials were above ground and nobody was paying attention, so he was able to take those bodies. He did also apparently, if memory serves properly, in the autobiography, he did say that the dead Shawnee didn't complain much, right? In somewhat jest. John Lewis did tell a story of when he was researching. He attempted to call the Shawnee chief, the current Shawnee chief, or maybe not the current, but the chief at the time, and talk about Dr. Still. And when in his Welsh accent, he asked if he could talk to the chief about the Shawnee chief about Dr. Still, apparently, and I'm recounting a secondhand story, the Shawnee chief basically said, "That guy? Forget that guy," and maybe in rougher terms, and hung up. So essentially, due to the open acknowledgement that Still did rob Shawnee graves for dissection material, the tribe today is still upset, and understandably upset about that, because their view of things culturally would differ from Still's view, and Still essentially defiled the dead, and many cultures would view that as a problem, and apparently they remember, right? So there is something there. Also, I have heard from Jason Haxton that Dr. Still could speak Shawnee, and that Shawnee is somewhat unique as native languages because it does have a written form, right, where other native languages did not develop a written form. To read again, on June 22nd, 1874, Still experienced a life-changing revelation that the works of God would prove his perfection. He saw, this is probably a typo, it says, his saw that nature constantly strives to express health. How it does so remains a mystery even today, for it cannot be explained by any known scientific law. Medicine is based on science, but Still reasoned that to find health rather than treat the symptoms of disease, the practice needed to be guided by a different philosophy. So there's something that I'd like to say here. Still coming to a different angle with respect to considering health and disease states, or a different philosophical position, requires what I would describe as faith. The faith that, based on his experiences, based on his viewpoint, you are presented with a human body that has the ability to heal itself, and that everything is there given the right environment, right? So those concepts, innate healing capacity and right environment, so right mechanical environment in Still's case, you have to have faith that something that you cannot currently observe because you do not have the skills to generate that environment is possible. So Still went about trying to figure out as often as he could, when somebody presents with a disease state, How often can I find physical abnormalities with respect to how things are moving, improve the movement, and have that disease state change, right? So he predicted that the medical community, as they were approaching it, or as he understood their approach, was missing an angle. He chose an angle, and he went ahead and experimented for a very long time. And his results, seemingly, were very positive with respect to his prediction accurately representing how reality works under certain circumstances. Because he definitely did note that if you gave me somebody with enough time or early enough, I can, or still could, positively impact their health state or move them towards health. However, there were situations where things had progressed farther than he was going to be able to remediate. Right? Where are we? To read again, as Rudolf Virchow, I think it's Virchow, had noted in his Cellular Pathology, a book that's still treasured, materialism had limitations when applied to the living being. Unafraid to challenge the norm, still adopted a new philosophy, one adapted from the English philosopher Herbert Spencer. So as I said, Herbert Spencer's there. I'll turn back to reading again, sorry. Whose thesis was a reconciliation of science and religion. Still's new philosophy, the law of matter, mind, and motion, blended the wisdom of deity. Could not only accommodate scientific knowledge, but also mind, a word that encompasses the wisdom of the body and life, a word still used interchangeably with motion and spirit, without assuming, as did science, that they somehow emanate from matter. This was a philosophy centered upon, not upon the material, but upon the immaterial, a spiritual philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to stop reading at that point. Anybody who's looking for this, if you look up John Lewis, osteopath, you will come to the website that he has related to his book, atstill.com, /timeless teachings. So /timeless teachings is the specific article that I'm reading from here. But to turn back to what we just read, the point of faith that Still was presenting was that there was something that was currently unobservable, that if you altered the mechanical state of a human body, that you would be able to set the environment for those things to work properly. So one of the challenges with making the claim that the spirit is the house of something, or that the spirit is what emanates from something, is that currently, or even in Still's case, it's an unobservable thing. And because it's unobservable, you can't prove it wrong, right? So if I can't see it, I can't say that it doesn't exist. And if I can't say it doesn't exist, I can't say it does exist. So there's a bit of a catch-22 with that approach. Nonetheless, the important thing that happened over time was Dr. Still made his prediction that there was a mechanical relationship to health and disease states, or between health and disease states. So you would likely find a corresponding mechanical issue when somebody was presenting a disease state. And when somebody was generally healthy, you should find a very minimal mechanical disorder. And he experimented with that over time, and he had a range of results, of which he reported on. He did acknowledge that if something had been present for too long, he was unlikely to be able to remediate it. So he made a prediction, and he experimented a lot, and he found some stuff out. The book that probably outlines this the best is The Research and Practice, or Osteopathy, Research and Practice, from, I believe, 1910. I'm pretty positive 1910. And he outlined a bunch of stuff there, more specifically than he had in the past. Because as he taught this, beginning in 1892, he would have had a lot of pressure to try to describe things, which he seemed resistant to, as far as I know. So he did have faith, and he did predict that there was a mechanical relationship between health and disease states. So again, in disease states, more mechanical dysfunction. In health states, very minimal or no mechanical dysfunctions. If you alter mechanical dysfunction, disease moves towards health, right? So he seemed to have gotten a decent way with that. But again, he did acknowledge barriers or endpoints to that, or things that did not support that. So he did acknowledge that. So again, to set the general stage, Dr. Still had a bad experience with respect to interfacing with the medical community. It's unlikely that he ever did a full medical training, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, especially in relation to something such as the Flexner report, right, which was trying to improve medical education in North America, so Canada and America. If I remember right, no schools were shut down in Canada, but there was many schools shut down in America because of the Flexner report. There, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, the Flexner report was fantastic or it was absolutely horrible. I've seen both sides. So we'll speak to that as we go forward. So we'll try to step through historical discussions over time. But still made his prediction, still had faith that something he couldn't currently observe did exist. And then to maybe wrap that up a little bit, the things that he felt were happening that he couldn't observe, he put into the construct of spirit, that which is unobservable. So, when Lewis is talking about this doesn't emanate from the materialism, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Currently, we're actually in a position where we still can't identify that. So to make progress, we gain value from making predictions of those things that if they do exist, we can observe, and if they don't exist, we can't observe, up to our current limit of knowledge. And as we continue to explore into those places that we can't currently observe, we end up being able to observe more. So faith, or the belief that something you can't currently observe does exist and can be observed, does end up helping us. Dr. Still showed that, not necessarily in a religious sense with respect to osteopathy, but more so in a scientific sense. He's made a prediction, mechanical relationship between health and disease states, ran a lot of experiments for a very long time, seemed to have some positive results, and did acknowledge some limits to it. So to reiterate things as many times as I can, I guess, to make sure that I'm setting the stage for further discussions. Again, if you're interested in the historical stuff, you could always reach out to the Museum of Osteopathic History in Kirksville at ATSU. You can find Jason Haxton. He is quite enthusiastic, quite knowledgeable. You can possibly look for John Lewis's book. You can look for John Lewis himself. I haven't spoken to him in quite some time. I'm pretty sure he is likely happy to have conversations with people. Carol Trowbridge, I don't necessarily know how to find. Her book does exist. It can be found online. But there's lots of historical material. Also, I think the state government of Missouri has funded the A.T. Still papers. So essentially, Still's actual handwritten notes are available online. So almost all of Dr. Still's writings are publicly available and completely free. So if you ever want to look for them, you can. I will warn you, his handwriting was not that sexy. It's somewhat hard to read. Please excuse me, unless you got a bunch of time and your screen is really good. So anyways, thank you for listening this far. Hopefully you learned something. We'll talk again soon.